The Fire Store, equipping protectors with passion. Every decision the Fire Store makes as a company is about its customers. As the holiday season has quickly approached, explore a wide selection of unique and practical gifts at the Fire Store's Gift Center. Find the perfect presents for firefighters, EMTs, and first responders today. The Fire Store's goal is to get you the gear you need when you need it at prices you can afford. Visit thefirestore.com for everything but the truck and shop its family of brands including Streamlight, MSA, Lion, Fleer, and more. Rosenbauer America is a leading manufacturer of firefighting vehicles and equipment with over 150 years of experience. Rosenbauer incorporates global strengths and innovation to provide a large and technologically advanced line of custom and commercial pumpers, rescues, tankers, aerials, and the battery extinguishing system technology. You may know it as the BEST. Visit the company's website for more information at www.rosenbaueramerica.com. Hi, this is Chris Mc Loone with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. Welcome to this episode of our podcast. We're doing another water delivery topic today, and this one's going to be cold weather operations. Now, you might think that that this only applies to the Northeast or the Midwest or the Northern Midwest. But you know, as I recall, just a few years ago, Texas had quite a cold snap where it really crippled some things down there, particularly with power and things like that. And also, it's not uncommon for us to be a little nervous about getting our Florida oranges. So you know, there are times when these cold weather type of operations can affect anyone anywhere. And they actually do go a bit beyond, you know, simply, you know, like, well, just make sure you crack the nozzle when you're not using it, so as not to freeze things up. So, as usual, I have my water delivery guys here. This is Andy Soccodato and Bill Adkins. Our whole water delivery, archive is available at www.fireapparatusmagazine.com/podcast. There you'll find all the water delivery ones we've done so far. We've covered three-way valves. We've covered intake valve selection, and now we're doing cold weather operations, which is good. We're in December. We're just, you know, really kind of, I know for the Mid-Atlantic, we're just kind of getting into some of our colder temperatures. So there are things that we need to be considering as we begin to operate in these environments. So, guys, thanks again for joining me. Bill, I'm going to start with you today. And I'm going to talk about cracking the nozzle. You know, a lot of people just think, well, as long as I make sure that the nozzle is cracked, you know, I should be good to go. So from your perspective, what are the challenges of operating in cold weather operations, operating not only the hose lines, but also at the rig, at the pump? What are the challenges, not only to the crews, but also to the pump operator?
Yeah, so when we think cold weather, we don't want to, a lot of firefighters don't want to be out there in those elements. And not only is it hard on us, you know, on our bodies, it's also hard on the pumps. It's hard on the appliances that we have. We got to keep things moving so that it doesn't freeze. We want to prevent things from freezing. And water and cold definitely doesn't mix. So we need to do what we can on the fire ground while we're getting ready to flow water, or when we are flowing water, to keep that water from freezing. So what can we do to prevent that from freezing? And it's usually moving water. Also, with the cold weather, we don't want, you know, when water hits the ground, we don't want to have the water on the ground because it becomes an ice rink. And we need to do things, and we're going to talk through this podcast on what tips we can do to prevent from causing this skating rink.
Andy, how about you? What are some of the challenges from your perspective, not only for the firefighters, but also for the pump operators?
Yeah, so like you said, a lot of people think from the firefighting perspective, right, crack the nozzle so that way the nozzle doesn't freeze up and the hose line itself doesn't freeze. But the pump operator, like Bill said, has to be mindful of everything else, right? So the pump freezing, the supply line freezing, and some of the other appliances that were freezing. So making sure that we move water in ways that keep that water circulating, so that way the pump and all those appliances don't freeze, but also doing it in a way that doesn't create, like Bill mentioned, an ice skating rink around the rig. So there are a couple of tricks that folks have come up with over the years to avoid that, depending on the setting that you're working in, that we'll talk about in this podcast.
So I'm in the Mid-Atlantic. I'm just outside Philadelphia. The past 2 winters for us have been pretty mild. Snowfall has been negligible at best. I think last year we had 0.3 inches actually recorded at the airport. So, it's been relatively mild, but you just go up a couple of hours to where I report into work, Rochelle Park, New Jersey. They're going to have colder temperatures and do tend to see a bit more snow than we do. And of course, when you get into New England, that's a whole other thing as well. But for me, we're at the time of year where we're going to have our monthly meeting. Where the chief engineer will remind all the drivers and operators, hey, we're hitting the colder weather. Make sure you recirculate water if you're going to be sitting there for a while. Now, again, that's the Mid-Atlantic. That's where we're coming from, because we're not seeing those cold temperatures, that are for a sustained period of time. Our highs in the winter time are mostly going to be probably mid to high 30s, low 40s. Every once in a while we'll have a cold snap where we won't get out of the 20s, but those are kind of few and far between. So where I'm getting at here is we run our pumps wet. If we stop, we're going to recirculate the water to ensure that they don't freeze. Do you advocate just across the board in the winter that departments should run their pumps dry? Or do you think it really just depends on that climate? Or because sometimes sometimes just going by a rule of thumb is a lot simpler than trying to pick and choose where you're going to do certain things. So Andy, I'll start with you. Do you advocate running pumps dry during the winter across the board, or should it be more for areas that see the cold temperatures, or should it be sort of a case by case? And in a case like we had in Texas a couple of years ago, where things really, really dropped like a rock, what should they be thinking about? Because they don't usually see those types of temperatures. So talk about running pumps dry or wet during the winter.
Absolutely. So like you, I started my fire service career up in the Northeast in New Jersey. So this time of year is, like you said, at the monthly business meeting and drill nights. Hey, remember to recirculate water and this, that, and the other. And just like you, we were running wet pumps in the department that I volunteered with in New Jersey. And moving further south, it becomes a little bit less of a more common thing. But what I found in my fire service career, and obviously I have never experienced the stuff that folks in Minnesota and Wisconsin are dealing with, where it gets a whole lot colder for a whole lot longer, have dealt with. And really the best reference that I have is an article that is published by Waterous. And you can go on Waterous's website and just type in cold weather operations. And they, in my opinion, they really break it down really, really well for different folks. And it really all depends is what it boils down to. They talk about the difference between running a wet pump versus a dry pump. And there are some people that take the mindset of, well, running a wet pump is a better option because it takes longer to freeze. And then the caveat to that is, while that is true, if the entire pump casing does freeze, it's a whole lot more damage that's going to take place. Whereas running a dry pump, the water may freeze, whatever water that is in the pump may freeze faster, but it's less likely to do damage. But what I love about that article is that they bring up some really important things to consider. Whereas, some examples are the temperatures that you're dealing with and how long your response times are. So if you're going, 20 minutes to a call and it's, 2 degrees outside, running a wet pump might be something that you want to consider, or excuse me, running a dry pump is something that you probably want to consider. But, where I grew up and where I worked in Virginia, it was very rare that we were consistently below 10 degrees and we only had 2 to 3 minute response time. So we ran wet pumps knowing that when we got to the fire scene, if it wasn't a working fire, the operators would just recirculate water to make sure that the pump doesn't freeze. So to your point, yes, I agree that rules of thumb are really advantageous, but it really is situationally dependent. Where I am in Tennessee and where I worked in Virginia, it was a safe bet to run wet pumps during the wintertime, as long as the operator knew to recirculate water once they got there. But again, those cold snaps that last a long time, and couple that with long response times, you really probably might want to consider the dry pump option. They both have their pros and cons. And like I said, that article published by Apparatus does a really, really good job breaking down the pros and cons that you should consider.
Bill, how about you? Where you are a career firefighter, you're going to, I think your temperatures are a bit more consistent on the colder side during winter than they would be in the Philadelphia area. What do you advocate? Talk about the dry versus wet pump.
Well, like Andy said, I can't advocate for what they do in Wisconsin or Minnesota, like he said. But in Cincinnati, yeah, you're right. We stay quite chilly up here during the wintertime. And we advocate the wet pumps. For the instance of there's multiple gallons of water in that pump, and it takes quite a while for that to freeze. Even on some longer response times where we may be driving at half an hour. If you took a 20-gallon bucket of water and you set it outside, how long is it going to take for that to freeze, even at 10 degrees? So it takes quite a while for that to freeze. We remind our pump operators when they show up on the scene to recirculate their pumps. That's the first thing that they're going to do. If we're going to a fire, obviously we're going to be moving water anyway, so they don't have to worry about the actual recirculation. But I would like to share my screen of I present and then share screen. I'm going to show you a cutout of a pump. And those cutouts, if you look inside that cutout there's a lot of crevices and places where water can sit, even when we do drain our pump. So once we drain our pump, there's a lot of places where water can still sit. So anyways, in a pump, when you take and you look on the inside guts of a pump, there's a lot of crevices. And when we drain that pump, there's really no way for us to drain every single drop of water. And then if we show up on the scene and then we get water into that pump, there's going to be ice cubes in that pump because of those crevices. And when you send that water to that discharge, there's a good chance that you may clog up the nozzle with those ice chunks. So that's another reason why I advocate to keep wet pumps through the winter, and just making sure that your operators are trained enough to recirculate no matter where we go. If we're going to be sitting somewhere, we recirculate that pump, move that water.
Just to clarify, because this is something where I think it's critical. So if you're going to, if we run them wet and we recirculate as when we get to the scene, is that something that you do as soon as you arrive? Whether pretending you're not, it's fire alarm, it's an AFA or something like that. Are you recirculating the water as soon as you get there, or do you wait and say like, well, if we're here for longer than 10 minutes, or is that where one of those rules of thumb really should apply? Either one of you take it.
We recirculate as soon as we get there so that we don't forget. Now, if we're going to be sitting on a scene for hours upon hours, the pump operator needs to be trained to be able to check that casing on the pump right behind the intake valve. If it starts to get warm, we can stop recirculating for a while and take the pump back, take it out of pump, and then go back an hour later and check it and then recirculate again.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with
Any
that.
comment on
I agree with that 100%. Our policy in the city of Charlottesville was in the wintertime, it was whether it's a medical aid or a fire alarm, as soon as you arrive on the scene, you're putting your pump in gear and you're recirculating water. Just to make sure, like Bill said, you don't forget, and we don't freeze that pump up. And also, like he said, making sure that you double check to make sure you don't overheat your pump. So it does put a little bit more responsibility on the operator to check things and make sure things aren't getting damaged. But that's your responsibility as a pump operator.
Okay, now we talked a lot about the pump to get us started. We talked a little bit about the hose lines as well. Bill, you just brought up the nozzles and some of the things that can happen there. But before the fire, before the call, are there other apparatus components that folks need to be thinking about when we are preparing for cold water operations? I mean, it could be something as simple as making sure all the drains are empty or something like that. I mean, are there other things that departments should be thinking about as they prepare for cold weather ops? Bill, we'll start with you on that one.
Well, one thing as something with the crew inside the cab, a lot of fire trucks, you have valves that you need to switch from air conditioning to heat. So there's one thing we do in the fall here in the Cincinnati area is once that temperature starts to lower, we're going to raise the cab or get into where the engine compartment is. And there'll be two valves, usually on the passenger side, that you need to switch so that you have heat. So if any of your departments are having issues with why is the heater not working on our apparatus, maybe check for those valves. You want your crews to be nice and warm when they get back on that rig and back to the station. And like you mentioned before, after every time we run the pump, we got to make sure the drains are opened up. Not the drain of the pump, but the actual discharges and intake drains, that we make sure we get that little bit of water out because that'll freeze very fast.
Andy?
Yeah. So along the draining portion, one thing, our rigs, we ran front intakes. And one thing that I would always want to make sure every day during my morning checks and after any runs was to really make sure that front intake plumbing was completely drained, because that will wreak havoc, either causing the valve to freeze up or, like Bill was saying, ice chunks to come into the pump. Our rigs also were running pre-connects all the way to the rear of the engine, the tailboard. So that run of pipe, even with the drains open, there was a tendency at times where there was water that would get trapped in the pipe. So what I would always make sure I would do in the mornings was disconnect my pre-connects to allow and make sure there's no water that's in that plumbing to drain out and not freeze up in the hose lines like Bill was talking about earlier. And one thing that I think is really beneficial, non-pump related to be checking and being familiar with when it gets to this cold weather operations, cold time of year, is making sure if your rig has on spots, making sure that those are deploying appropriately and making sure everybody knows how to drive and what the appropriate speed is for your on spots according to the manufacturer. And then what we would always do to make sure that everybody was familiar in the November time period, we would practice and make sure everybody knew how to put the actual tire chains on the rear axle. So that way, if we were out in the middle of the day and snow came and we couldn't get back initially or couldn't get back to the firehouse where we had to chain up ahead of time, we would be proficient with being able to chain up in the street if we had to.
You mentioned on the pre-connects and the drains there and disconnecting the pre-connects. What about intakes and discharges, the master intakes and the master discharges? Would you do anything there? I mean, I'm picturing, sometimes, I mean, you take the cap off to connect an LDH connection. Sometimes you get quite a bit of water flowing out of there. Would you also do that as well as the pre-connected hand lines?
100%. And one thing that I just want to make sure I clarify going back is I wouldn't leave the pre-connects unconnected. I would disconnect them, drain them, and then reconnect them back. So that way they're ready to go. And I just didn't get any freezing there. But I would do the same thing on the intakes. But this is where it's really important. Like if your intakes, if there's water in there, it's important to understand and figure out, is that water there because the intake valve was cracked a little bit and that's why that water built up in there? Or is it because the seal in that valve needs to be rebuilt? So this is a good time to be thinking about, okay, do I have to be buying rebuild seal kits and making those repairs? Because that is going to cause a problem if it's time to go to work.
We've been focusing a lot here on pumpers that that have pumps, not necessarily tankers or tenders or pumper tankers, pumper tenders. But I wanted
you said
to
it right the first time. You said it right the first time.
I don't want to get into a debate, but
I'm with you, Andy.
I know what I call them, so just as long as you know what I'm talking about, that's good. But I did want to get into some of the tanker operations or the shuttle operations when we are working with when we're working with portable tanks and things like that. What are the water delivery challenges in the cold water when we're talking about tanker or tanker shuttle operations? Bill, I'll start with you since you were very anxious to to get in on that with the proper terminology.
Right. With tanker shuttles, the big piece of that is when we're dumping water into a dump tank, you got the valves. We want to make sure we get that shut. As we drive away with those empty tankers, there's always water still flowing out of that back discharge. And when we put water on the ground, we know what's going to happen. It's going to turn to ice. And then now you have that skating rink we were talking about. Not only for the firefighters, but the fire trucks that may be backing back up to that dump tank. I've seen trucks on a skating rink, and then you got the natural curvature of the roadway, and they're backing up to the dump tank, and all of a sudden their rear starts to slide towards the ditch. Now, fortunately for us, it didn't go all the way into the ditch, but something we could have done to prevent that skating rink was, and what had happened was when they drove away, in the summertime or any time in the climates where it's warmer, we'll leave that valve open and then drive away. That way you can kind of get the rest of that little bit of water out so it doesn't swash around. But in the wintertime, we need to make sure that valve is completely shut, and take a towel, put your arm inside that chute and kind of drain that water out so that when we do drive away, we don't get that water on the ground. Something else with tanker shuttles I would like to mention is when you do put your drain to the dump tank, make sure it is facing into a ditch or a drain of some type so that when we do drain it later on and we're doing our cleanup, we're not on that skating rink like we're talking about.
Andy.
So yeah, everything Bill hit on the dump site. Where I've seen a lot of problems in my experience is the fill site. The fill site can very quickly become an ice skating rink because, when the tanker, typically in the warmer months, we don't care if the tanker overfills when we're doing a fill operation. In the winter months, when it's overfilling, we're going to create a huge ice skating rink there. So in the warmer months and warmer climates, I typically tell folks, yeah, let it overfill. It doesn't matter as long as you're not on gravel or dirt or, something like that. But in the winter months, you really want to make sure this is one time that I probably am not going to fill the truck until it overfills. So this is where tankers that have a sight glass style gauge on the back so I can actually see how full it is. Or I know a lot of modern tankers we're dealing with, the LED tank fill indicators. We have to be careful when we trust those because hopefully they work. But again, it's one of those things where after the first couple fills, you probably should get a good idea of when that thing is full all the way without letting it overfill. And that is certainly a balancing act. And like Bill said, with draining your dump tanks at the fill site, what I want to make sure is after I'm, filling, after the fill operation is done and I'm breaking my fill lines, I definitely want to walk those out so that way it's easier to connect to the next truck. But make sure you walk those out in a ditch line or off to the side, so that way you're minimizing that potential to create a hazardous working area.
One thing that we can't overlook also is response to and from the scene during cold weather operations, both in a pumper, a regular structural firefighting pumper, and on the tanker side. Those tankers are different to operate. They do require a different response mode. Warm or cold, but certainly with when there's snow on the ground, when there's potentially ice under that snow, again, from my area, we have, we might get snow, but it's not always going to be super cold. So you'll get the snow, it'll come down, it'll start to melt and then freeze up again overnight. So now you've got a lot of times you either have ice, a sheen of ice on top of the snow that's already there, or underneath. So you really have to watch with those things as well. And that's when we get into the on spots or the or having chains on them as well. But cannot overlook that. Wanted to talk. I'm sorry if you guys have comments on that.
To your point about that, I just know that there are some fire departments that I've worked with in the wintertime and stuff like that. They'll automatically adjust their response mode. So to prevent some of that, their tankers will roll non-emergent, right, to fires or anything to kind of help with that, and make sure that we're driving these things in a safe manner, especially in these hazardous conditions.
Now, I wanted to talk about again staying on the tanker side and doing some drafting. I don't. Where I live is a hydranted area. I can't think of any time in the 30 years that I've been in my fire company that we've ever had to draft beyond pump ops training or recertification. So we don't really get into that too much. But I wanted to talk a bit about tactics for drafting out of a frozen pond. It could mean different equipment. Maybe the strainers on the ends are different. Smaller, so you just chop a smaller hole in the ice, or maybe there are some other things as well. I wanted to talk a bit about that. Andy, I'll start with you. What are some of the tactics that departments can think about when encountering a frozen pond or a frozen water source for drafting?
Absolutely. So everybody needs to recognize, if you're a part of this operation, this is a really hazardous scenario that you're dealing with. Okay. And if you're unsure of how thick this ice is, right, you can become a victim yourself and create a whole other issue. So one of the things that I like to teach folks is make sure that when you're performing these operations, you don't want to be in turnout gear, right? Especially if for whatever reason you happen to fall through the ice. Make sure you're dressed appropriately, but also warm. Okay. And turnout gear typically isn't the best option for that. With that being said, I will always advocate placing a ground ladder on the ice, just like we would do for any ice rescue type of scenario, to help distribute your weight. Now, with regards to the equipment and the drafting equipment that we're using, I know a lot of fire departments, they will have specialty strainers, which are called ice strainers. And essentially it's a pipe that goes 90 degrees down. So that way you can just cut a small hole and drop that right into the ice and you're ready to rock and roll. The advantage of that is you can really only have to cut a hole big enough to put that strainer in to fit it through. If you don't have one of those, then you're going back to typical, making a hole big enough to get your hard sleeve in and around that edge. One trick that I picked up from a cousin of mine who is up in New Jersey, they were challenged with drafting out of a frozen lake, and they took their chainsaw and they cut a hole like they would a roof. But the problem that they weren't paying attention to the angle that the chainsaw was coming in. So when they cut their hole, the ice ended up wedging in. So they had to really fight to get that ice so where they could get it out. So if you're thinking about it, try and put your chainsaw so that way it wedges out and you can just push it right underneath. So rather than coming in at an angle like this, maybe come in like an angle like this. So that way it makes it to where that ice will fall into the water once you get through. The biggest thing with cutting out those holes, make sure you only cut it big enough. It's not like cutting a roof where we want a 4 foot by 4 foot. We just want it big enough so we can get the strainer in there and go to work, and we don't have somebody falling in and getting trapped or anything worse. I know some fire departments up in like Minnesota, Wisconsin that deal with this routinely. They may have ice augers and stuff like that. That's something I personally have never dealt with. Bill, I don't know if you've had any experience with those, but those are the major things we want to be thinking about.
Bill?
Yeah, it's so dangerous to be out on ice, especially when it's the very beginning part of the winter. And, guys up in Wisconsin and Minnesota, North Dakota, they know when their ice is solid enough to be walking on. Something I would recommend, if you know that you're going to be cutting into ice, don't do it alone. Have somebody on the shore able to rescue in case when that ice may be able to hold you in normal conditions. But once we start cutting into it, it may weaken that ice to where now you end up falling into it. Have somebody there to assist you if you were to happen to fall in. I do have a screen to share, and I'll send it to you as well in that email. It is the ice strainer. It's got 90-degree angle like what Andy was talking about. That way you can show that in the podcast as well. That's a good idea with that chainsaw technique there with your angles. I've heard of people having problems getting the ice out. They're trying to pull the ice out, where if you can do that angle the opposite way, you just push it down and it just goes into the water.
One thing I failed to mention with regards to PPE, and I just want to make sure I clarify this. This is, in addition to not wearing turnout gear, make sure you're wearing a PFD or a personal flotation device, right? That's really important as well.
Is there ever a case to be made where, and this is, I don't know because I don't encounter this. It sounds like this question wasn't too far out there because there are techniques to be doing this. But is there ever a case to be made where it's just find another one? Find one that's not frozen, or find one that we hope isn't frozen, or just shift gears entirely and start calling every tanker you can find to supply the water. Is there ever a case to be made then? I mean, should it just be, we were talking about rules of thumb and across the board? Should we avoid frozen lakes or frozen ponds altogether?
Yeah, if we have the choice, we can, but there's some places in the country where they don't have a choice. If they're looking for a static water source, it's going to be frozen. But yes, if you can send more tankers, that's even better.
Yeah, I agree with Bill. I think our friends in Minnesota and Wisconsin, they're going to agree that if we don't cut through the ice, we're not going to get water. I know where I am in Tennessee and where I worked in Virginia, freezing over wasn't super common, but it could happen. And there were times where it would freeze over enough to be frozen, but not enough that I would want to walk out on it. So in those areas, to me, it's more risky. And if I know that I have a flowing water source that is sufficient for volume and everything like that and isn't frozen, to me, that's a safer option that compared to that half frozen over water source. And again, as long as it's the same distance and if everything else is the same, then I think that's a better option.
We talked about frozen ponds. What about frozen hydrants? I've seen pictures of firefighters, pump operators with blow torches trying to thaw those things out. I think most of the time, probably if you encounter one, you go, "This is frozen." You're just going to go to the next one. But what are some other considerations if you encounter a frozen hydrant for those of us that are in hydranted areas?
A lot of that comes with preparation. In the fall, both here at Fayetteville and at Lovell and Sims, we check our hydrants in the fall to make sure that they are drained. just like, a lot of things in the fire service, we're always preparing for that next run. So we check those hydrants to make sure that they are drained and they are not frozen when we do get there.
Yeah, I would recommend. I know of a scenario where fire department encountered a frozen hydrant, and crews were working to remedy the problem. They got the caps off and they sprayed de-icer down in the barrel to try and help, unthaw it. Well, the next guy that came up didn't know that de-icer was in there, and they put a road flare in there, and they had a nice little explosion right there. Didn't hurt anybody, didn't hurt the hydrant, but just things to think about. Unless every hydrant is frozen over, a lot of times the best option is to probably just go to the next one, like you were saying, Chris. And in my opinion, I think this is one, we talked about the four-way valve in a previous podcast. This is one scenario where a four-way valve comes into play, because I can hook the four-way valve to the frozen hydrant and then reverse out from that four-way valve and connect into the valve. And then the clapper will just clap over when I get to the good hydrant. So that's an option for dealing with a dead or frozen hydrant and the four-way valve. And it just kind of makes things a little bit more seamless in the transition. But definitely be careful about using road flares and thawing agents, because bad things can happen.
Laney, that kind of takes me right into the next question, and that is, and you just cited one instance, but what are some of the issues that you have encountered yourself, or that you've heard other fire companies have encountered during cold weather operations?
Yeah, so me personally, the biggest thing typically has happened on the rural side with dump chutes freezing up and like Bill was talking, and fill site issues like that. But I know of scenarios in this state where I work, where a lot of times folks don't think about the aerial waterway. And I know of one instance where a department was flowing water on a larger scale fire out of their tower ladder. They were flowing out of the monitor. They switched gears from the exterior operation, were cleaning up. They stopped flowing water out of the aerial and they left the monitor open, but the aerial was at a position and all that water was still in the waterway. They never drained the aerial waterway because the aerial was still up. Typically, a lot of people think, well, I just open the aerial drain when I go to bed it. Well, when they went to bed it, all the water in that waterway had frozen. And when they retracted, the actual waterway on the last fly bent outward from the ice. So the truck company, in order to get the aerial to stow, they had to take K-12s and cut the waterway off the truck to bed the ladder. So in these colder environments and time periods, when you're done flowing water out of your aerial device, even if the aerial is going to stay up in the air, open that aerial drain to help prevent that very, very costly repair.
Bill, how about you? What are some things that you've either heard about or have experienced yourself, in addition to what you talked about earlier?
It appears like a lot of things we've had issues with was the nozzleman not cracking the nozzle, and then it ends up turning to slush. They'll when they open it up, they don't have much pressure at all. It just comes out like a slushy does. So your nozzlemen need to make sure that they're moving water as well, not just at the pump. And another thing I've encountered is we always teach pump operators to recirculate the water. And what do we do when we are in a rural setting when we have tankers? Where do we recirculate that water to? If we're getting water fed to from a tanker, or in the rural hitch from another pumper, we got that water coming into us. We need to keep that water moving. What do we do with that excess water? We don't want to waste water. So what we have come up with, and we didn't invent it ourselves, but we put a diverter line back to the dump tank. So it may be several hundred feet, but it's going to save you in the long run. For one, you're not wasting water, and we're just going to recirculate that water back into the dump tank and just keep that water moving back and forth either through your roll hitch or your nurse tanker operation. If you are not moving water, it will freeze.
Yeah, we've talked about. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andy.
I'm sorry. I had one other thing to add to that. Bill talked about how to recirculate in the rural environment. One trick that I like to do in the urban environment is a lot of folks will just recirculate and leave their tank fill open. Well, the problem with that is right now we got an ice skating rink in the street. So in the suburban and urban environment, one tool that I love in the wintertime is a cellar nozzle. What I'll do is I'll take some 2.5 or 3 inch, connect the cellar nozzle to it, and then just throw it in a storm drain and then just charge that. And now that keeps everything recirculating and all the water's going in the storm drain. And if it freezes, it's in the storm drain, right? It's not in the street where I'm working. Now, the public works department might not be happy, but I'm not hurting my guys out in the street. So just a little trick that I like to use in the urban and suburban setting.
Now, we've been talking about recirculating water. We talked about just what you just said now, everything Bill just mentioned, including cracking the nozzle. And we talk about that, but what about the line laying in the street? How do we prevent that from freezing up? It's a lot of water, so it's going to take some time. But how do we move that around to keep things moving?
If we're talking about supply line, we're gonna, by us recirculating and keeping water moving, that water is moving as well. And depending on how cold it may get, the more you may need to open up that recirculate more and more to keep that water moving. Because on the outer edges of that intake valve or at a supply hose, it's going to start to gel up, and then you could restrict your flow if needed. So the more, if you feel like you need to recirculate more, do so. Just make sure that if you're in a rural setting, it's going back into the dump tank instead of on the ground.
Yeah. How about you? Any tips on supply line, keeping it from freezing?
That's one thing. One of the reasons why I really like that cellar nozzle option, especially in the hydrant area, hydranted areas, because if you get the 2.5 inch version made by Elkhart Brass, at 100 pounds at that tip, you're flowing 500 gallons a minute out of that cellar nozzle. So that's a significant amount of water that you can move through that supply line to help prevent that freezing option. So again, like Bill said, in the rural setting, you got to move water. And if you need more, flow more. The question, if you have the dump tank, that's easy to flow it back. In the hydranted areas, a lot of times I don't have the ability to put 1,000 gallon per minute deck gun in service without freezing up the neighbor's yard or making a bigger mess than I want to be. So that cellar nozzle in a storm drain, I can easily flow 500 gallons a minute in addition to whatever the fire scene is flowing.
Yeah, with that fire scene, what they're flowing, keep that in mind too. If they're flowing a lot of water, a lot of GPMs a minute, we don't have to recirculate because we are moving water anyways.
Okay, well, before I let you guys go, I'm going to ask for some general comments, but also if any of the audience has a question for either Andy or Bill or a comment on the podcast, please let us know. chris.mcloone@clarionevents.com. Also, if you have a topic you would like us to hit on, either Andy and Bill or just a topic that we haven't hit on yet in the podcast series, let us know. We've got a whole army of people that we can bring out of experts, of subject matter experts that we can bring out to address your topics. But guys, again, thank you for joining me today. Before I let you go, do either of you have Andy? We'll start with you. Do either of you have any general comments on cold weather operations as we start to get as we start to encounter some of these temperatures?
Yeah, just follow your manufacturer's recommendations, your department SOPs, and again, this is you want to get outside and you want to train and you want to make sure you're proficient on all these operations, and stay safe out there.
Bill?
Road salt and sand, depending on what you guys use in your area. Some things we do in the fall, when the fall comes, we go ahead and get our road salt ready, and that's something we add to our compartments. 20 or 30 pound bag, have it ready. When you do get that water pump operators need to know that when there is water on the ground, let's throw some road salt down.
All right. Perfect. Well, again, my thanks to you guys. You jumped on board with this. This is our last one for 2023. So my thanks to you for jumping on board with this and supplying some of your knowledge of water delivery to our audience. I'm looking forward to continuing this next year. So again, my thanks to both of you for not only joining me today, but for the last several podcasts. Again, I'm available at chris.mcloone@clarionevents.com. If you have any comments or you have any topics you'd like us to hit on, please let me know. Other than that, everyone, have a good one and stay safe. The Fire Store, equipping protectors with passion. Every decision the Fire Store makes as a company is about its customers. As the holiday season has quickly approached, explore a wide selection of unique and practical gifts at the Fire Store's Gift Center. Find the perfect presents for firefighters, EMTs, and first responders today. The Fire Store's goal is to get you the gear you need when you need it at prices you can afford. Visit thefirestore.com for everything but the truck and shop its family of brands including Streamlight, MSA, Lion, Fleer, and more. Rosenbauer America is a leading manufacturer of firefighting vehicles and equipment with over 150 years of experience. Rosenbauer incorporates global strengths and innovation to provide a large and technologically advanced line of custom and commercial pumpers, rescues, tankers, aerials, and the battery extinguishing system technology. You may know it as the BEST. Visit the company's website for more information at www.rosenbaueramerica.com.